Welcome to Chautauqua Books. I'm Roy Harvey. My guest today is Paul Leon. He is the author of 4 books about the Chautauqua region and a historian, a researcher, and a storyteller. Paul is someone you should know if you already don't, and I'm sure most of you do. Last time, however, on Chautauqua Books, we closed the show with the discussion of saying that you should turn off the television and read a book, maybe Paul Leon's books, one of Paul's books. But this time I thought that was sort of a cowardly thing to do, and this time I thought we'd say, all right, turn off the television now, before we started. You might read a book, one of Paul's books, perhaps. So let's just do that right now. Let's give you a chance to turn off the television. So, how are you doing, Paul?
Yeah, I'm doing just fine.
Yeah?
I'm comfortable so far.
So far? Yeah, that's good. We'll have a drink and we'll see if we can
let's do
come
that.
back in just a second. What do you think? I think that's about enough time, don't you? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're going to open our show here with ghost stories, one of the first of the books we're going to be talking about of Paul Leon's. All right, we could have some lights, I guess, here. Well, if you've joined us back, go ahead. That's great. Thank you, gentlemen. If you've joined us, Ghost Stories is published by a Westfield publishing company. And what is the story of ghosts? Why the fascination with ghosts?
Well, it's more a fascination with history,
Okay.
with local history. But
Right.
ghosts is sort of a trick to get people to read the history. And it's also
I see. So it's a heuristic device, is what it is.
Yeah, but I have a sense of ghosts as a sort of related to our history.
Mm.
To me, the memory of event, the memory of historical event, is similar to a ghost, and so it's an easy sort of lead from historical event to creating a story.
So it's not. It doesn't worry you that you're sort of creating a kind of friendly attitude towards superstition as opposed to empirical science or approach to things?
Well, this is fiction.
Yeah.
This book is, of the 4 books, this is the only one
Right.
that's fiction, and so one may take certain liberties with the fiction. It's similar to creators of historical film. You take certain liberties with the history in order to make a well constructed piece of art. The ghosts will draw readers. My intention is with these books and with the fiction as well as the nonfiction is to bring into the local consciousness the history of the area. So it gets.
And another thing too about this particular book, there's not a lot filled with a lot of supernatural and. It's pretty straightforward stuff.
The ghosts are, by and large, in the book, the ghosts are historical figures, or some of them are from my imagination. But the event surrounding the ghost is an historical event, a documented event, one that I have researched
Right.
prior to making these stories.
One of the first story intrigued me quite a bit. It was a man who was hung. He was hung because he killed his wife.
That's right.
He killed his wife because she read from the Bible all the time and probably preached at him and gave him no end of service. And I thought maybe a Johnny Cochran or a Marvin Belli could have got him off with that kind of...
Well, actually, that man was defended by one of the premier lawyers in the area. That's
Really?
right. I'm not sure why Joseph Damon killed his wife.
Well, the Bible thing is...
The Bible
here.
thing I used, you see, that I used in for the purposes of the fiction.
I see.
But in the documentation that I have seen and sort of was the starting point for these stories, they all start with certain documentation. Actually, I had the transcript of the trial held here in Mayville. The information came out that Joseph Damon was not quite right. And if you're reading the story, you will see that the eyes, Joseph Damon's eyes, play a big part. Because in the defense, in the documentation, the eyes did play a big part. It seemed that this man went a little haywire on a regular basis, and that appears to have been what the defense was at his trial.
I see. Now you say that Ghost was essentially a device to encourage people to become interested in history. Is that worked out in terms of the sales of the 4 books? Would you say this one has done as well or better?
Yeah,
or what?
this book is a sort of a cult book already in
Really?
Chautauqua County. Yeah, it's in its 4th printing. So, and as a matter of fact, that is just about gone now too. So the book is sort of hard to find now. Yeah, this book has been very, very popular,
Really?
and it's been, for me, it's been a real treat. What has happened to me with the book is I have done several sort of talks on the book, appeared in groups and done talks,
Right.
and always after talking about the book, folks approach me and give me their ghost stories from
Really?
Chautauqua County, which works well for me, of course. So yeah, it's a very, very popular book. Sure.
That's another thing. Before we get into the other books, and I want to talk about the Civil War, the soldier next. But the phenomenon of storytelling. It seems to me that what's going on is that essentially media in this country and in the world essentially has centralized control of what we know about ourselves. And storytelling dates back to Homer and beyond in terms of bringing people up to speed on their own local history. Is that your kind of perception with regard to storytelling as a genre? Or?
Yeah, it's wonderful, and I agree with you that that we are seeming to become a less verbal people, and our stories and our culture is being given to us rather than being learned by us.
Right.
In a lot of cases. But I'm also encouraged that that in this community, and I would say that probably in most communities, the local people continue to tell the stories, especially in a community like this. Our community is interesting in that generations, the folks who live here, many of the folks who live here are the descendants of generations way back. So folks have their ancestors in Chautauqua County, which makes the history stay here, and which makes the stories travel from one generation to another. We are such an isolated.
And by community, what are you talking about? I mean, you're talking about essentially a couple of counties?
No, well, I
Northwestern?
use community, well, so it expands and contracts.
Okay.
Generally, what I mean by community is the county.
Right.
But it can expand beyond the county into western New York and the area, or it can contract into like Jamestown.
Right. And do you think that that's particularly unique? I mean, I know the South has a lot of that, or has much of it at least.
Sure.
But it's a fairly unique phenomenon. It's a highly mobile society, isn't it?
I think our Chautauqua County is one that has not been touched nearly so much as most of the rest of the nation.
It
the
is
country.
extraordinary that you can have conversations and know people that have generations that date back to 1800s, early. Or 1800s.
Yeah, even early. Now, our history is young.
Yeah.
Our history here is young because if you're talking about settlement or European settlement, it's 19th century.
Right.
Whereas if you're talking in New England or on the East Coast, you're talking 17th century. So that's 200 years difference, and it also means since the history is young, and since our ancestors are very often we are the descendants of those who have lived here for generations. The history has remained, and it's accessible. It's very easy to find that history, and it shows up in lots of places. I mean, it shows up in garage sales and estate
Right.
sales and all
Yeah.
kinds of places that you get your hands
It's
on
an
it.
odd thing too, though, that it shows up in garage sales and so forth. I mean, you talk about the poster that you've located
right.
in a garage sale, but because essentially it's devalued in that sense, you know.
True.
When you find
As far
it
as you're going to put a
essentially.
monetary value on
Yeah.
it.
I mean,
sure.
devalued in terms of its cultural importance, in addition to the money, you know.
Well, sometimes something
Except by
comes up.
experts and historians and people like
Sometimes
yourself.
something
and,
comes up that is extremely valuable,
Right.
historically valuable.
Right.
And one of the books that we will talk about today is that type of thing.
Right. But what I'm saying is that we'll get on to other things, but the whole phenomenon of a centralized media that doesn't engage people on their local history is something that actually storytelling and you and
Yeah.
others do
Yeah.
affect or
That's right.
deal with.
I have tried as a storyteller to sort of identify myself with Chautauqua County,
Right.
so that there's
That's got to be pretty much the case with anything. I mean, if you take Garrison Keillor, it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's just sort of,
surely,
you have to.
surely.
That's what it, you know.
Surely.
They're not-
There are others who will identify with their ethnic background,
Right.
and back to the old country and take the folklore and the stories from the old country
Right.
and give them out. But,
We'll turn to the other book, next book,
Okay.
and not in chronological order in terms of the production, but Do As You Think Best, The Civil War Letters of William DePledge. Extraordinary book in terms of the kind of ideas that he has about the Civil War and so forth.
This book touches my heart. Primary source affects me. I mean, what we're dealing here is primary historical source, and I have this reverence for primary source, and it comes out in the materials that I bring out. And this touches my heart because it is not only valuable historical information, but it tells an extremely touching family story, and of course it's a local story. It's a story. William Depledge was a farmer, a tenant farmer in Arkwright when he enlisted into the war. And the letters are mostly letters that he wrote back to his wife, left back on the farm in Arkwright with 3 children. So William went off to the war, leaving his wife with 3 children to run the farm. Now, you have to understand that must have been an extremely difficult thing for her to do, to raise the family and keep the farm running while William was off in Virginia fighting the war.
Yeah, it was tough running a farm with the 2 of them.
Surely,
and so on.
a tenant farm.
Right.
They were working on shares, and his reason for enlisting was because the money.
Right.
The
And that really
bounty.
comes through. I mean,
Yeah, it does,
The,
it does.
The problem with, I mean, that's a large part of the content of this letters, of course, is the paymaster and where he's going to be and collecting the money. It's also very interesting too in terms of the kind of work that's done by the Union Army in terms of articulating what this war is about. He's sort of oblivious to that in a way. I mean, he knows, but he's not really at one with it.
He, in a way, is separate from. He's not an extremely patriotic person. His motivation is the money and taking care of his family, and that comes through very strong. There is as much material in this collection of letters. The material is as frequent and as the compilation of the material is as much in Chautauqua County as it is off in the field of battle where he's fighting. He will describe his experiences, the work he's going through, and the movements of the unit. But the main concern is what's happening here back on the farm. That comes through very, very clearly in this book, and it gives that feel of the home front. I mean, the war was not simply the battles.
Right.
it was those left behind as well, and that comes through in these letters in a very touching way.
There's also the phenomenon of the kind of class division between himself and the officers. He says the officers are basically trying to prolong this war because they're getting
He
paid
does say that.
extraordinary amount of money. So you have a man whose ideas are intact. It's not really changing him that much with regard to the focus of this war. Abolition, for example. There's a lot of abolition, as you well know, abolition activity in this area. The next book we'll be talking about it. And he's not at all.
No, he's not at all. As a matter of fact, I think it was quite common if you're off in the field of battle and you're sleeping in the woods and you're experiencing a sort of a dangerous and dirty and difficult time when you're in the war, and it's easy, and you're losing lives, you're losing friends, and you're liable to be injured yourself. And William is in and out of the hospital throughout his 3 years in the Army. It's very easy to get to try and put some blame, and William will blame, we're fighting this war for the slaves. He will put blame there.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing there is that it doesn't seem to be that they're doing, it's not a war of propagandizing one's own soldiers. It's these guys are in there, we're fighting this battle, it's day to day, it's dying of disease all around you, and bullets and whatever else. And each man is kind of isolated in a sense. He thinks for himself, he doesn't really, have a whole lot of military propaganda coming out of it.
That's another of the beauties of primary source.
Right.
You see, these are very, very intimate and personal thoughts. William is writing home to his wife, and there's no sense that these would ever be read by anyone other than his wife.
And yet, too, it's odd because the personal, the intimate thought comes from the wife. I mean, she's much more treating him as if he's a close human being, and he signs his letters, with his last name.
It's very formal. That's very 19th century.
Right.
Very formal.
Yeah. But you almost get a sense of her, almost more. Although she has about, I don't know.
There are six letters written by Jenny.
Right.
In here, and of course now one would ask, how in the world did those letters survive? Because they were sent to William off in the war, and one certainly could guess, even without knowing the outcome of his story, that in order for her to get those letters back, somebody would have had to send them back. Either William would have had to bring them back, or, as is the case, William dies towards the end of the war, and the letters are sent back with his effects.
Right. So many of those effects were just simply sold, and the money was sent to her. So at the end.
Yeah, there wasn't much.
There wasn't much. Right.
But the pathos of that collection of letters, well, there's a lot of pathos. What happens in the course of the 3 years is now William has gone off to the war, and he has the 3 children, the youngest being, by my reckoning, no more than 2 years old. And
he did get a furlough.
That
for
child
a week
died while he's off in the war, and so he is,
Yeah.
of course, notified from home that his youngest son has died. He manages to get a furlough to go home and be with his wife and family and to grieve some. And while he is there, his wife conceives again. Of course, he doesn't know it when he goes back. He goes back to the war. Certainly finds out, and his wife bears another child while he's off. He never does see that.
There's
child.
an interesting story too, kind of a subtext or a kind of counter plot in this the war widow woman. What did you make of that? What's going on there with the fellow who's alienated from his wife, and she's a
that term war widow was a term, I believe, not only used for someone whose husband died, but somebody whose husband is away.
Oh, really? There seemed to be some real problem there, but that's pretty esoteric for us to discuss now. When people read this, what do you think is you would like them to get out of it mostly, this book?
They're going to get a sense of Chautauqua County. They're going to get a sense of bleakness, the bleak landscape of Chautauqua County, and the difficulty subsistence farming
Right.
in Chautauqua
also-
County at that point. But they're also going to get a good sense of the movement of the 112th Regiment,
Right.
the Chautauqua Regiment, which William was part of.
And did you follow up much of on that story, the 112th, and if people want to follow up further on the 112th Chautauqua Regiment, how would they do it?
There is a history of the 112th Regiment, and that was the real fun part for me in putting this book together, is because I had the history. Of course, it's a rare book. You might find it in our reprints of it in our libraries, but that history was written by the regimental chaplain, who, of course, followed the regiment the entire way. And so I had the history. He made the history from letters and records and his memory of the engagements and the movement. And I took that history and I had the letters together, and I had the two to use, so I could take the letters and compare them to the history as written by Hyde and see how they correlated and see how the movements were the same.
Really?
That's the best way to follow the history, is to start with the history of the 112.
Any particular surprises in this? Special surprises in going through the research and saying, "Oh my God, this is extraordinary." Any moments like
There's
that?
there's always a great
Lots of
deal of surprise. For instance, one of the things that really tickled me about the history is, and of course the man's name, the commander of the 112th Regiment, Colonel Drake from Westfield. The history describes the choosing of the commander. Colonel Drake
Primarily
was
because
a
of
minister.
the moral.
Yeah, he was a minister. Of course, the units, or those who were forming the units, those who movers and shakers who were responsible for getting the recruits, they chose Colonel Drake because he was a minister and he wanted to take care of the moral, the straight and narrow for the Chautauqua boys off in the war.
Yeah, he died, of course, in '63.
Cold Harbor, '64.
Did you get a sense of his competency as a
commander?
commander?
Oh yeah, it was pretty clear, and generally, I think the writers might overplay this, but I think it was quite clear that he was well beloved by his by the unit, and well, he died in the bayonet charge at Cold Harbor. And his competency, sure, I would say that he was quite competent.
Okay.
Yeah.
He had been a commander of a earlier, I think the 49th.
He was a captain. He was
Captain.
he was a.
So he had experience. Military.
Well, now you see, this is a man
Maybe.
who enlisted because of his patriotism.
Right.
You check the motivation, or you try to get into the motivation of anybody for enlisting, and his was patriotism.
Right.
So.
Well, we're going to turn to another book, and one that I found just incredibly fascinating. That's Sketches in the History of the Underground Railroad. It's the story of the Pettit family, is that correct, Pettit? And the two generations there. And it's a fairly comprehensive look at the Underground Railroad.
Western New York, Chautauqua County, Cattaraugus, all of Western New York,
Right.
all of the Lake Erie shoreline, this is what it is. This is the book that I said earlier, sometimes local historical material will appear that has an extremely high historical value, and this does. These are the reminiscences of Eber Pettit. Now, Eber Pettit was an agent, an Underground Railroad agent, operating out of Versailles, which is a tiny isolated village just across the border in Cattaraugus County, sort of on the border of Erie, Cattaraugus, and Chautauqua County, right on Cattaraugus Creek, which empties into Lake Erie. So Eber was a notorious, by the end of the war, a notorious agent. His father lived in Fredonia. So his father also, now his father inspired in him his abolitionism. And so his father operated out of Fredonia and sent fugitives to Eber in Versailles, and Eber sent them forward to the Niagara River for crossing into Canada. These are his remembrances after the war. he had become a wealthy man selling patent medicines. His father was a, quote, doctor and a patent medicine merchant. And his father managed to come up with a medicine, an eye medicine, that made Eber rich. But
The son.
Yeah.
The son and the father. And the,
Yeah.
and the father, right.
When Eber's father died, when James Pettit died in 1849, the manufacturing of these medicines was going on in Fredonia. Eber was living in Versailles, and he took he took the manufacturing out to Versailles, and that was his business. He traveled in the South selling the patent medicines. He was a well-traveled, well-educated man, and he was he was an acquaintance of the movers, the Western New York movers, the political people, the judges, politicians, and he was a notorious Underground Railroad agent, asked after the war was over to contribute to the Fredonia Censor newspaper his remembrances of his experiences as an Underground Railroad agent. That's what we have here. They're taken from the Fredonia Censor, reprinted with my annotation.
Right. And footnotes.
Yes.
Yes, footnotes. You're talking about annotation.
Well, they're not actually footnotes because I didn't want it to be too academic.
Well,
So what
they're
I've
not-
done is,
yeah.
is try to reference
Right.
material that would come up in the individual
Right.
sketches
But
that
that
might
is all
not be
yours,
clear.
right.
Yes, all that is mine.
Because it's kind of, you don't really know the book's going to end, and then all of a sudden you're into the annotated or footnote so-called part, and it would be good to have it as you go, I think, so you know that there's a little bit more on this particular as you're reading. But what I'd like you to do is to put into context for us the Underground Railroad. I mean, essentially stimulated by the Slave Act.
Fugitive Slave Act.
Fugitive Slave Act.
Well, sure, but
1850.
see, it's way beyond,
Sure.
way earlier than
Yeah,
the Fugitive
right. But I
Slave
mean,
Act.
the really heavy part.
After the Fugitive Slave Act,
Right.
the Underground Railroad became more organized,
Right.
you see, because there were those in the North who weren't so anti-slavery, or might not have been so anti-slavery until they were called upon to actually return runaway slaves, to aid in the capture of runaway slaves, which they refused to do. They thought that law was an abomination. As far as the context of the Underground Railroad, this is one of very few primary sources that we have.
Really?
Now, of course, any Underground Railroad activity, operations were by and large kept very secret, because by its very nature, it was a law breaking, a civil disobedience sort of
In reading
an
this
affair.
book, it seemed to me that you could make a case that was comparable to the French resistance during the Nazi occupation of France. I mean, not everybody knew what was going on.
Surely,
And,
there
it was
would be
dangerous stuff.
Surely.
Not only was it illegal, but you had a lot of neighbors who just didn't want to know that you were doing this.
Surely, and it was kept very secret. Now, one of the things that this sort of opened my eyes to, Pettit's material here, was I never could quite comprehend bounty hunters or slave owners actually pursuing their runaway slaves into the North, because I couldn't figure out how it could be worth it to chase a runaway slave because of the expenses that one would incur.
Buying them on the market, or the hoof, or whatever they called it, right?
That's a term that Eber uses in the book, buy them running.
Yeah.
So a bounty hunter might buy up from a number of slave owners title to these runaways in the hopes that he could go and catch the runaway and make a profit on the speculation.
And he says, it 1 in 10, and he made his money.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to buy up, the way Eber puts it, this particular slave catcher, bounty hunter, had a hat full of titles to particular runaways, and he was up looking for runaways or possible runaways along the Niagara River, and if he managed to catch a single one, he might have paid, a 20th or a very small amount to the owner for the title of this runaway, in hopes to in hopes to capture that runaway, sell him back into slavery and make a profit.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, it's yeah, it is. It's hard to comprehend. For me, it was very hard to understand. A slave owner hired a slave catcher. That slave owner would very likely be paying the expenses of a bounty hunter to travel into the north to try and retrieve a runaway slave, or even in the south. And the expenses would mount up. I mean, if you're pursuing a runaway slave and it's I mean, you're staying in hotels at night and you're having to pay for transportation, the hiring of horses, you're having to feed yourself.
Talking about some really, it's a horrible thing to say, but it's expensive people here. $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, particularly for some of the women that they were after, or the skilled men, or strong, skilled men.
Well, sure. Of course, a slave's value depended on what he or she was capable of doing for his or her owner.
Right.
Now, there are, Eber mentions at least one slave in there worth $3,000 who came through Chautauqua County, came through Jamestown.
A lot of money.
That's a lot of money. That's an extremely valuable slave. Also, there is a great deal made of in that book about the value of attractive slave women being extremely high for their sexual allure.
Right.
And the New Orleans market is identified as a place where attractive slave women could be sold at a high price.
Quite often, it was usually two things happened to stimulate running away, escape. One was sexual abuse or use. Any use is abuse in this situation. The other one is knowing that you're going to be sold, or a child's going to be sold, or somebody's going to be sold.
Yes, that was that motivated large numbers of slaves to run away. The suspicion, or in Eber's reminiscences, several of his stories begin with a particular runaway having heard, either through his family or another slave, overheard that his owner was planning to sell him. And now a lot of these runaways were coming through the border states. Okay. Now our section, Chautauqua County, Western New York, Eastern, Western Pennsylvania, and Eastern Ohio. This is sort of the western section, and many of the runaways who came through our area would come from Kentucky. They'd come up through Western Virginia. They'd come up through Maryland and through Philadelphia and up this way. A lot of them were border state slaves.
So Texas and Missouri and all that are coming up through Illinois mostly, and Ohio and so
Well,
forth.
you can understand that it would be very, very difficult for a runaway to make it to Lake Erie through from Texas.
Right. You got to cross the Mississippi on top of everything else.
Yeah.
Most of it.
Slaves did run away to Mexico.
Really,
But
I want to ask you a question before I forget it, and that is, as you well know, in Switzerland during the Second World War, many Jews who wanted to escape Nazi Germany or Austria or whatever tried to make it into Switzerland. And Switzerland refused over and over and over and over to allow people in. Did you find that any sort of semblance of that sort of phenomenon in Canada?
no.
Nothing.
The Canadian government, by and large, I believe, welcomed the fugitives. There was an attempt by the American government early in the 19th century to conclude a treaty with the Canadian government for the return of runaways, but the Canadian, well, this was, of course, the English.
Right, that was the English, essentially.
And this is another thing, I'm glad you brought this up, because often when we are talking about fugitive slaves, the Underground Railroad, and slavery in general in America, we sort of end it with a runaway having arrived in Canada. But if you just use your imagination some, and of course these primary sources help you with your imagination because they give you material to stimulate. having arrived in Canada is like, and Eber actually uses this metaphor, is like being born again into a new world. He talks about one particular fugitive who arrives in Canada pretty much naked as the day he was born. Almost his clothes are in rags. But then that fugitive, that refugee, is now a refugee, and having been born into this new world, which is essentially a wilderness,
Right.
that person has got to be able to keep it together to survive. Now, there were refugee centers in Canada, and there were people willing to help. Eber Pettit mentions a number of Canadians who take the fugitives in and hire them and give them work. So, and my sense is that Canada was a very, very sparsely populated country, and
And also, you know, a person who's made it across that line, you have a tremendous determination. You have something
definitely.
But another thing too, this North Star. A quick lesson in astronomy. You know, keep the sun in the evening. I mean, it's basically Polaris. You know where Polaris is. You find the north that way. That's a tremendous phenomenon, isn't it?
Eber mentions over and over in his reminiscences about a slave's education. And he says the slave's education consisted, or a slave needed that one piece of knowledge if he or she was going to run away. Right. That was what the education was, the ability to find the North Star. But let me mention something that to me is a wonderful image, and also is wonderful for the imagination and thinking about a slave running out of slavery and being on the loose in hostile land,
right?
Which
every person,
which would be the case if you were running away from.
Because all you know is the South. You know, you don't have time to learn the attitudes of the North.
Every white man is your potential enemy,
and may be one.
Yeah, exactly. But Eber gives in one of his stories relates directions given to one of the runaways that he writes about. And those directions are just wonderful to hear, but also very scary if you put yourself in the place of that runaway trying to follow those directions. Okay, this is a slave man who ran away from fairly into the deep South, managed to cross the Ohio River, and was given directions by a passerby, someone he ran into. Or I may be remembering wrong. It may be someone who actually helped him get across the river. Somebody sort of peripherally involved in the Underground Railroad. The man was told to follow the North Star. Now, put him in southern Ohio, having crossed the Ohio River. Follow the North Star until you come to water that you cannot see across. Take a right.
Right. Yeah.
Follow the water until you come to a place where you can see land and houses on the other side. And that is Canada. So if you get there, you will be free. There is no slavery. It's just an incredible sort of a thing to think about.
There was one, too, where there were a couple, a man and a woman, I think, and they were saying, follow the road until you see a man standing on the railroad tracks who says, Ed.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
That's a really great story. Now, in the course of my research...
I mean, can you imagine Ed standing there for months?
These people got lost. This was a group of 5 runaways running away together, and they actually got lost their way because they were told to follow these railroad tracks, and when they came to the depots to skirt the depots, and they got lost. So they arrived at the point where they were supposed to pick up some help much later than they had thought they would. But according to Eber, the man was still there and separated them and sent them on. But the work for me, and actually the joy of doing the work in this book, and in most dealings with primary source, is to, in the course of the research, to find what corroborating sort of material appears. And that corroborating material is stuff that comes in our county, which is in our local archives. That particular story is about a runaway slave by the name of Joe Norton.
Right.
And I was really, really delighted to find a significant amount of material on Joe Norton, because Eber Pettit...
Syracuse business, I mean.
Yeah, yeah. But before that, in Chautauqua County, Eber Pettit ran into Joe Norton. Joe Norton escaped and got into Albany, came from Albany to Fredonia. Eber ran into him somehow and agreed to give him board so that he could go to school.
Right.
Give him board and work
Right.
so that Joe Norton could go to school and learn how to read. Now, Joe Norton had run away, leaving his wife and child. And it turned out that Eber and a number of other Chautauqua, Cattaraugus County folks managed to help Joe Norton purchase his wife and child out of slavery by helping him, convincing him to go on a lecture circuit, the same way that Frederick Douglass did.
Right.
He did this in western New York, in Chautauqua County, Cattaraugus County, Wyoming County, Erie County, to hold lectures. He was a runaway slave. He's going to talk to folks about life in slavery the same way Frederick Douglass did, and take up a collection. And he managed to collect the money to purchase his wife and child out of slavery.
There's a tremendous, the story that you're telling is a tremendous story of the kind of intellectual, moral, holistic, in a way, historical development of this character, of this man. Norton.
Yeah, it's a great story. Now, Eber spends a lot of time with Joe Norton because, well, this is a person that he knew very well. And the corroborating material comes up in the archives at Chautauqua County Historical Society in Westfield. And what it showed to me is the connections here between Eber and some of these other fancy folks, some of these other prominent folks in Chautauqua County, and I'm talking specifically about Judge Foote, Elio Todd Foote, prominent judge in Chautauqua County, lived in Jamestown from very early on. And we're talking about the 1840s now. Judge Foote was a Chautauqua County historian, and the main local historical volumes that we have, Edson and Young, that we use in Chautauqua County, come from his records. But he kept records. He kept notebooks. And he sort of separated the notebooks into different categories, and one of those notebooks was an anti-slavery notebook. Judge Foote was an abolitionist. He was very, very active in the Liberty Party in the 1840s. So was Eber, and so was Eber's father.
Right.
So they had that connection this way. But that material, the material that is still there in Chautauqua County Historical concerning Joe Norton, is corroborating primary source to the story that Eber gives us here in these reminiscences.
Right. So. Your book, this book, Sketches, tells some heroic stories about towns standing up to the slave catchers and standing up to the law enforcement, to the postmaster or whatever it is. But I don't want to deal on that right now. What I want to say is, when I was reading it, I was thinking, this is extraordinary how many actual, all the way up through the South, you've got some folks, white people, helping these runaway slaves. And you have this over and over and over. Then it occurred to me, hey, these are the guys that made it through. You know, you really can't look at it that way. There are a lot that didn't.
Oh, definitely.
And so what you're getting is a picture of a kind of moral activity on the part of the ones who succeeded. The rest.
Well, a lot of what we tend to forget, especially we white folks, tend to forget when talking about the Underground Railroad, and it's sort of you get that sense with Eber Pettit in here too, is that there's Ebert has a bit of a patronizing attitude, although he
Sure. How could he not?
well, he was a very well-educated man, got to be very wealthy, and he considered his work in the Underground Railroad work to be very humanitarian work, and it was.
Right.
It most definitely was, but still, his caste, his social standing was certainly much higher than the runaway slaves he was dealing with. Of course, we do tend to forget, I think, that a runaway slave, a fugitive, out in that hostile territory would be avoiding white men.
Sure. Well, there's that story about they're trying to help this one runaway slave. I believe it's a man, and I know it's a man. And he says, "That's all right. We're abolitionists." And the man is almost, horrified. We're abolitionists. Abolitionists.
Yeah.
Don't worry, we're abolitionists.
Yeah.
And he knows abolitionists because that's what the Southern slave owners had told him. It means cannibal.
Yeah.
And that sort of phenomenon has got to happen over and over and over.
Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is a hero of mine, and in my research for the book, I relied heavily on Frederick Douglass's writings. Now, Frederick Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, and being able to get into the mind of a man who was a slave. He ran away when he was 20. He ran away from Maryland, the border state. He made it quite clear to me that what a potential runaway, what a slave considering running away would be thinking. This is what Frederick Douglass was thinking, contemplating escape. Right. He talks about what he called the real distance to make it between a slave state and the free state, and if you're going to go all the way to Canada. But the real distance, the distance in terms of miles, and what he also called the imagined distance. Right. And the imagined distance was what was, according to Frederick Douglass, was terrifying. Because if a slave would have been taught from the beginning and would have seen through his experience in slavery that it would have been dwelled upon that escape was impossible. And slaves may have heard, and most slaves would have heard of this promised land called Canada, which must have had a sort of a mythological sense to it, that there was this place. But how could a slave possibly conceive of the distance between Virginia and Canada, and the understanding that if that slave were to run away, between the distance between Virginia and Canada, he would be facing hostile territory and everyone an enemy. Not only would he be facing everyone an enemy, he would be facing starvation, he would be facing the dogs.
And the stories of the dogs, I mean, those are key part of it.
Yeah, that came through for me pretty graphically, because the dogs, they talk about nigger dogs in this book. What I've done is take other primary sources sort of to color what Eber says. So I want more than one primary source in here, and advertisements for runaways appear in the book, and also advertisements for someone who wants to sell nigger dogs, or chase your runaways. I've got these fine dogs to chase runaways.
And the stories that get back, that are told over and over and over to a population kept ignorant, totally ignorant, to the degree that you can, as a slave owner, are that the dogs shred people. I mean, just rip them up
the
totally
slaves
apart.
would understand, or would be told that, and they would know, they would see too.
Sure.
They would see injured and badly injured runaways that the dogs had.
Especially, I mean, anybody that actually got injured would be hauled out as evidence. And
surely.
Let's see. A question I had was, this is an extraordinary period in Chautauqua's history and in this particular section of New York and the whole of the North. We have a few, what I'm wondering is to what degree, I mean, from 1839 roughly to 61, thereabouts, and maybe a little longer, even into the Civil War, to what degree do we acknowledge this in terms of public statuary and so forth? Because you have not only those people who were doing it here, but then, like Joe Norton, many of them who become strong parts of the Underground Railroad. To what degree do we publicly acknowledge this with statuary or other things?
Most of what we see today, and you can take Chautauqua County as an example, take Jamestown as an example, what we see are Underground Railroad sites identified by historical markers.
Okay.
As far as statuary goes, it would only be, I'm not sure if there is a statue of Frederick Douglass. I imagine there is one somewhere.
But I mean, it is a key part of an important part of this history of Chautauqua, isn't
well, what is going on now nationally and statewide is quite exciting as far as the the history of the Underground Railroad goes, is because there is national effort, national energy, and as well as state energy to identify and document Underground Railroad personages and sites. So there are large groups interested in this history who, and there is a clearinghouse in Washington. There is a man in charge of this effort. So the word is spreading around, and there are groups in Chautauqua County, in Buffalo, well, not so much Chautauqua County, but in Buffalo, who are spending a lot of time and energy in trying to document sites, and that's why the primary sources are so important.
You were talking about some of the things that you were finding in garage sales that would turn up periodically. This is one of yours.
Yeah, now that I didn't find. That was.
I mean, you had a copy made of this particular thing. This is a. Well, tell us what it is.
Well, that Mr. Vince Martonis, town historian from Hanover. Town of Hanover, found that in a house in Chautauqua County, and it is a reward poster for a runaway slave, $25 a reward. That's a cheap reward, but I think that by and large the rewards would be of that amount rather than.
And this happens right after the Fugitive Slave Act, pretty much. I mean, August 50 is when I think October of 1850, and this is 1851.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Yeah. It appeared in the house, and Vince found it in the house. He's got the original, and he was kind enough to photocopy it for me like that. How it got here into Chautauqua County is anybody's guess.
Somebody
You
clearly
can't tell
saved
that,
it for
but,
some reason, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think we better turn to. We don't have much time, actually, for Around Chautauqua Lake. It sort of concludes, in a way, the 4 books, because it's photographs that just follow the Civil War, pretty much, from 1875, 10 years, to 1925. Marvelous story.
It's those are, again, they're beautiful primary source, and give you that image of that sort of sense of the resort area of Chautauqua Lake, which was really, must have been a really, at least the way we see it now, we see it as a very, very romantic era, and lots of color and lots of activity and generally high times.
Well, one of the things that was very interesting to me is looking at through these photos. Of course, these are all black and white, and the maps are marvelous of the railroads around the lake and so on. A wonderful book to have. But there were some color ones too, and it just was impossible to reproduce color in basically a black and white book, wasn't it? Yeah. We're going to take a look at some of the slides.
Okay, sure, surely.
I think we're basically starting with Chautauqua and moving toward Mayville. We don't have
Okay,
much time.
since we're up here in Mayville,
Yeah,
sure.
right. Well, we're all over, actually.
You're looking at Palestine Park at Chautauqua Institution in the 1890s. You can tell, we've all been to Palestine Park, we've all been to Chautauqua Institution. You can see the roll of the hills there, and the costumes are nice. You see the lady with the parasol, but it gives that sense of time there, that sense of well, it's got a nostalgic feel to it. For this one, you're looking at Fair Point. You're looking at the steamboat landing, where Miller Bell Tower is.
Right.
This photograph was taken in 1875, and when, okay, now you're looking at accommodations, a tent on a platform, in the early visitors to Chautauqua, that's where they would stay. That is adjacent to, those cabins are adjacent to Miller Park. In the photograph in the book, you will see this more clearly, that there are benches out there because before the amphitheater was built, this is where the lectures were given. They were given in open air. This is one of my favorite images. This is this would be looking from the Chautauqua House in Mayville to the building that we are in
Right.
for this taping, the railroad depot, showing two...
Tremendous activity, wasn't there?
Yeah,
Extraordinary.
there were three,
Boats?
at one time there were three docks out in this area into the lake. And this also shows the sort of building, the barge on the left is... I've got a soft spot for this barge. It was a little sort of a deli sort of a
Yeah.
thing.
Coke
But
and hot tea. And
before
Coke.
it was
Coffee and
before
hot
it
tea.
was docked here at the depot, it was actually pulled around the lake by one of the steamboats, and I could imagine that there would be bands playing on there. It was called the Floating Bird, a little sort of stop and fast food place, a little restaurant.
You know, looking, well, here we have Lighthouse Point, I guess.
Lighthouse Point, between Chautauqua and Mayville. The hotel at Lighthouse Point, of course famous for the lighthouse that was put up there, showed on the lake and identified the spot.
One of the things when you look through the book, you think, my gosh, it was cold back then. Everybody's got so many clothes on. This is summer stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we're out of time, Paul. It's been a delight.
Oh, it's been fun for me, so I really
thank you very
appreciate
much.
coming here and being able to share the books.
The books are around Chautauqua Lake, and the ghost stories, or Chautauqua ghosts, sketches in the history of the Underground Railroad, and that's in the Chautauqua, Cattaraugus County, this section of New York. Marvelous, marvelous book. It's well worth your time. And of course, the pledge, Civil War letters. Last, I want to make some comment about our lights business. There are just a couple of ways you could look at television, and one, you could just turn it off, and that's the solution. A lot of people don't have televisions, and that's a way to deal with the problem of television, and it not to be over, essentially, you spend too much of your life involved in consuming television and what it induces you to consume. Another thing, rather than do that, there's a way to, and what I hope we might do is to look critically at television, to involve yourself in some extent in the process of television, and to think about what's going on. And that's what I hope we might do in part with Chautauqua Books. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time, if you don't turn your television off. Paul.